Mabel Whitaker drove her wagon axle deep into Wyoming mud and made a decision that nearly killed her. She would get it out herself or she would die trying. Her hands were already bleeding. Her dress was soaked through to the skin. The horse had stopped pulling an hour ago, and less than a mile away, smoke curled from a ranch chimney. Warmth, help, another human being, and she refused to look at it. She had not asked a single soul for anything in 11 years. She was not about to start now. If this story speaks to the woman you are, or the woman you used to be, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and stay with me all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The mud was the color of old rust, thick and cold and indifferent, and it held her wagon the way a trap holds an animal, not with fury, but with patient, grinding certainty. Mabel Whitaker stood at the rear left wheel and looked at what the road had done to her, and she did not cry. She had not cried in a long time. Crying required a kind of surrender she had decided years ago she could no longer afford. Instead, she pressed her lips together, pushed her sleeves up past her elbows, reached down into that freezing muck with both hands, and pulled. Nothing moved. She pulled again. The mud made a sound like something laughing at her. "All right," she said, out loud, to no one. "All right then." That was how Mabel talked to trouble. Not with prayers, not with curses, not with the kind of weeping that brought neighbors running. She talked to it the way she talked to a stubborn knot in a bolt of fabric, quietly, practically, with the full understanding that she was going to win eventually, and the only question was how long it would take. She was 35 years old. She was a large woman, solid and round-figured, with a face that people tended to underestimate right up until they had a problem they couldn't solve themselves, at which point they came to her first. She had brown eyes that noticed everything and wide hands that could sew a torn seam, so fine you'd never find where it had been, could butcher a chicken or haul a 50-pound bolt of wool off a loading dock without asking for assistance. She had traveled more miles alone than most men she had ever met, through weather that didn't care what she looked like and roads that didn't care what she deserved. She wore a practical dark dress, mud-spattered now, from hem to hip, and a wool coat that had seen 5 Wyoming winters and looked like it. Her brown hair was twisted up under a worn felt hat she'd bought off a market table in Colorado 2 autumns ago. She was not a woman who spent money on vanity. She spent money on wagon repairs and canvas and thread and horseshoe nails, the things that kept her moving. Keeping moving was the only plan she had left. Wagon was her home, her livelihood, and the last remaining evidence that she had rebuilt a life from near nothing. It carried 2 trunks of fabric she had purchased at considerable expense in Laramie, 3 boxes of completed quilts she was transporting to a dry goods merchant in Red Creek who had promised her a contract worth more money than she had earned in any single month since she'd started this work. A sewing machine strapped carefully between wool blankets, and a small wooden box under the driver's bench that held everything she owned of value: her money, her contracts, her the deed to nothing, because she did not own anything that couldn't be packed and moved. That was the life she had built. It was not a grand life. It was not the life she had imagined when she was a girl in Ohio, sitting on her mother's porch and sewing her first straight seam, and believing that the future was large and bright and full of people who would love her well. But it was hers, every inch of it was hers. And she would not lose it to a patch of mud on a forgotten ranch road in Wyoming, because she had taken a shortcut that the man at the livery in town had told her was perfectly fine, that she had suspected was not perfectly fine. And that had turned out to be, as she had suspected, not perfectly fine at all. She assessed the situation the way she assessed every crisis, without flinching, without wasting time. The left rear wheel was buried past the hub. The ground beneath it had given way, a hidden seam of soft earth beneath a crust that had looked solid enough, the kind of trap the road set for travelers who were moving too fast or paying too little attention or, in Mabel's case, trying to make Red Creek before dark because she did not have money to spend on another night in a boarding house. The horse, a dun mare named Agnes, who had carried her since Nebraska, and who had strong opinions about mud, had refused entirely to pull Ader, and was standing at a sullen angle that communicated very clearly that she considered this situation to be Mabel's fault entirely. "You're not wrong," Mabel told her. Agnes flicked an ear. Did not look sympathetic. The ranch house was visible from where Mabel stood. It was maybe 3/4 of a mile up the road, a solid-looking structure with a barn behind it and a fence line running north. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, steady column. Someone was home. Someone was warm. Mabel looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned back to her wagon. She was not going to that house. She was not going to knock on a stranger's door with mud on her dress and her wagon stuck in the road like some helpless creature who couldn't manage her own affairs. She had done that once, 11 years ago, in a different kind of crisis, and the person who had been supposed to help her had instead taken a great deal from her and left her considerably worse off than she had been before she asked. She had learned the lesson. She had learned it thoroughly. She went to the back of the wagon and began unloading. If the wheel wouldn't come free under the weight of the loaded wagon, she would unload the wagon. Simple, straightforward, backbreaking, yes, and the light was already going pale and thin with the late afternoon cold, and her hands were not going to enjoy this. But it was a problem with a solution, and she was going to execute that solution. And then she was going to get back on that wagon and drive the rest of the way to Red Creek and deliver her quilts and sign her contract and find a room for the night in that order. She started with the trunks. A full trunk of wool and cotton fabric weighed somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 pounds. She got her arms under the first one, heaved it free of the wagon bed, and carried it to the side of the road, setting it down on a patch of dry grass with the kind of care that communicated exactly how much those fabrics had cost her. She went back for the second. Her lower back registered an opinion. She ignored it. The boxes of quilts were lighter individually but awkward. And by the time she had moved the third one, her shoulders were burning and her boots were soaked through, and she could feel the cold working up from her feet toward her knees with genuine malice. She went back for the sewing machine. The sewing machine was the item she could not replace. The fabric she could source again, at cost she couldn't afford, but she could source it. The quilts she could remake, given months she didn't have, but remake them. The sewing machine was different. She had bought it 4 years ago with money she had saved 1 coin at a time over 2 years of work, and it was the thing that had transformed her from someone who survived to someone who had a trade, a business. A reason that merchants contracted with her specifically, and not with any other traveling seamstress. It weighed 45 pounds without its carrying case, and it was wrapped in 2 wool blankets and strapped to a wooden frame she had built herself. And getting it from the wagon bed to the side of the road was a process that involved a great deal of angled leverage and some language she would not have used in company. She set it down, stood up, put her hands on her lower back and looked at the sky for a moment, which had gone from pale low gray to the kind of deep steel blue that meant real dark was maybe an hour away. "Mabel," she said to herself, "you are in a situation." She had a small shovel tied to the side of the wagon for exactly this kind of emergency. She got it free, walked back to the buried wheel and began digging. The mud was heavy and cold and resistant, and it sucked at the shovel blade with every stroke, and after 20 minutes, she had made enough progress to attempt another pull. She put her shoulder against the rear of the wagon and pushed. Agnes, sensing the attempt, leaned forward into her harness. The wheel shifted. Mabel felt it move, felt the momentary possibility of freedom, and pushed harder, with everything she had left, her boots sliding in the mud, her legs shaking, her breath coming in hard white clouds in the cold air. The wheel sank another 2 inches. Mabel stepped back. She stood there breathing. She looked at the wheel. She looked at the road. She looked at the ranch house. And then a voice said, from somewhere behind her and to the left, "That ground won't let go easy." Seen it take a full freight wagon once. Took 4 men and 2 extra horses to get it out. Mabel turned. There was a man standing at the edge of the road, maybe 20 yards away, with a pair of fence pliers in one hand and a spool of wire in the other. He was looking at the wagon with the particular expression of someone who has seen this kind of problem before. and has formed quietly a series of thoughts about how to address it. He was perhaps 32 at the outside. Dark hair under a working man's hat, the brim bent from use rather than fashion. He was built the way men who work outside are built, not for appearance, but for the work itself, shoulders and arms that had been shaped by years of actual labor rather than any intention toward how they looked. His coat was a worn canvas duster, his boots were as muddy as hers. He was not looking at her the way men usually looked at her when she was in trouble. He was not looking at her with pity, he was looking at the wagon. 4 men, Mabel said, her voice was flat. That's very helpful information. Wasn't trying to discourage you, he said, just giving you the facts. I didn't ask for the facts. No, he agreed, you didn't. He didn't move, didn't come closer, didn't offer help. Just stood there with his fence pliers and his spool of wire and looked at the wagon like he was still thinking. I've got it handled, Mabel said. He said. It was not an agreeable sound and it was not a disagreeable sound. It was the sound of a man who had an opinion he was choosing not to express yet. I mean it, she said. I don't need assistance. Didn't say you did. He tilted his head slightly, still studying the wheel. You've got the right idea with the shovel. Problem is you need to dig out from the front of the wheel, not the side. Give it a channel to roll forward into. You're digging it a bigger hole. Mabel looked at the shovel, looked at where she'd been digging. Felt with considerable displeasure that he was correct. I would have figured that out, she said. I expect you would have. He said it without irony. Without condescension. Just a plain statement, like he genuinely believed it. Takes about another 40 minutes of digging done right. Light's going to be mostly gone by then. I'm aware of the light. You traveling alone? Clearly. To Red Creek? Is this a conversation you need to be having? He looked at her then, for the first time since he'd spoken, actually looked at her face, not at the wagon, not at the wheel, at her, and she saw that his eyes were a dark, steady gray. And that whatever he was reading in her expression did not seem to alarm or deter him. My name's Colton Reeves, he said. I work this ranch. I've been fixing fence line about a quarter-mile back. I can help you get that wheel free in about 15 minutes if you'll let me, or I can go back to my fence and you can have it free in about 2 hours if the dark doesn't stop you first. He paused. Either way's fine with me. Either way's fine with you, she repeated. Yes, ma'am, you don't care which. I care some, he said. But it's not my wagon. She stared at him. In her experience, men who offered help in situations like this one were never actually neutral about whether you accepted it. They wanted something from the offer. They wanted gratitude, or deference, or the sense of themselves as capable and necessary. They wanted you to recognize that they had rescued you. That was what the offer was really about, usually. The help was just the container for what they actually wanted, which was the particular look on a woman's face when she admitted she couldn't do it without them. This man was standing at the edge of the road, with his fence pliers, looking like he genuinely might go back to fixing fence and think nothing more about it. Why would you help a stranger, she asked. He considered the question seriously. Because the road's bad here, and it's getting dark and your cargo looks expensive. And because I've got a good hour left before I need to be back at the bunkhouse, and a wheel in a mud hole is the kind of problem I know how to solve. He shrugged a small, economical motion. Doesn't need to be more complicated than that, and you want nothing in return. I didn't say that. Her jaw tightened, and he went on before she could speak. What I want is to not spend my evening knowing there's a woman stuck on this road with dark coming. That's what I want. Call it selfish if it helps. Mabel looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the wheel, she looked at the sky. She thought about the merchant in Red Creek, about the contract, about the quilts sitting in boxes in the mud grass of the roadside, about the sewing machine she could not replace, about Agnes standing in her sullen harness, about the cold that was already past unpleasant and moving toward genuinely dangerous, about the morning she would have spent here if the dark stopped her, about the boarding house she couldn't afford, about the pride that had served her so well for so many years, and was currently serving her a 2-hour mud excavation in failing light. Fine, she said. The word came out like it had been extracted under pressure, which it had. "But I'll thank you not to make a thing of it." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "Wouldn't dream of it, ma'am." His name she found out over the next 40 minutes because working beside someone in a mud crisis creates a particular kind of forced conversation was Colton Reeves, and he had come to Wyoming from Kansas 4 years ago. And he worked for a rancher named Burkett, who owned this land and 400 head of cattle and about 600 acres of fence line that needed constant attention. He said all of this in a tone that suggested none of it was particularly remarkable, which was the tone, she noticed, in which he said most things. He knew what he was doing with the wagon. He dug the channel in front of the wheel forward, as he'd said, not sideways, giving it a path, and then he talked to Mabel about where to put her weight. And she told him she knew how a wagon worked, and he said he expected she did, and then explained anyway, and she almost argued and then didn't, because he was right about where to put her weight. They pushed together. Agnes pulled. The wheel came free with a sound like the mud exhaling. Mabel almost fell forward into the channel and caught herself on the wagon frame, and Colton was there with a hand out, not grabbing her, just present an offer of steadiness she could take or leave, and she left it, caught herself, straightened up, and stood with the cold air on her face and the distinct relief of a problem solved moving through her chest. "There," Colton said. "There," she agreed. "You want to load back up and move before the temperature drops another 5 degrees. That mud will freeze, and you'll have a different problem." "I know, I'll help you load. I know you can." He was already moving toward the boxes of quilts. "I'm helping anyway, won't take long." She stood there for one moment with an argument halfway formed and the cold on her hands and the light going fast, and then she went to help him and said nothing, and they loaded the wagon in under 10 minutes, him lifting without complaint. Her directing where things went, because it was her wagon, and she knew the balance she needed, and he listened without questioning it, which was not something that happened to her often. When the last trunk was loaded and the sewing machine was strapped back down, she turned to thank him and found him looking at the right rear support brace of the wagon with a slight frown. "What?" she said. "This is cracked." He ran his thumb along something she couldn't quite see from where she was standing. "Not broken yet, but a bad rut and it'll give." She came around to look. He was right. A split in the wood, running with the grain, not deep enough to be an emergency but deep enough to be a risk she hadn't noticed. "I'll have it repaired in Red Creek," she said. "You'll be in town tonight?" "If I leave in the next 10 minutes, he straightened. Looked at her directly again. "All right, take the main road back. Don't cut through the lower field. There's soft ground down that way too, this time of year." "Thank you for the advice, Colton Reeves," he said, and touched the brim of his hat. "In case you need to know who to blame if it goes wrong." She almost smiled. She caught it before it arrived. "Mabel Whitaker. In case you need to know who to thank when it goes right." He smiled, then a real one, brief and genuine, and stepped back from the wagon. She got up onto the bench, took Agnes's reins, clicked her tongue. Agnes moved, the wagon rolled, the mud released them both. Mabel did not look back. She looked at the road ahead and drove, and tried to understand why the knot in her chest that had been there for 11 years felt, for the first time, very slightly looser, as though someone had found the end she hadn't been able to locate and pulled, gently, just enough to suggest that untying it was possible. She decided that it was the relief of the wagon being free. That was what it was. She drove on toward Red Creek with the last thin light on the hills, and she told herself she would not think about Colton Reeves again. And she was wrong, but she didn't know that yet. She arrived in Red Creek in the full dark, her hands stiff with cold, Agnes moving at the tired, deliberate pace of a horse who had had enough day. She found the merchant Aldrich's dry goods store, still lit from inside. He'd been waiting for her, or at least for the quilts, and she backed the wagon to his loading door and began pulling the boxes out. And he came to the door in his vest and spectacles, and looked at the time and then at her. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "I was beginning to wonder." "Road trouble," she said. "The quilts are fine." He helped her carry the boxes in, which she allowed because there was a contract to discuss, and she needed goodwill on her side. He opened the first box, and she watched his face while he looked through the quilt's log cabin pattern. Double wedding ring, a flying geese in deep red and gold that she was most proud of, and she saw the quality register in his expression, which was a merchant's expression, and therefore carefully, guarded but not guarded enough. "These are fine work," he said. "They are. I've been getting inquiries from Denver," he said. "Eastern buyers coming through, looking for genuine frontier craftwork. Not manufactured goods, real handmade, the kind of quality that tells a story." He looked at her over his spectacles. "I think we might be talking about a larger arrangement than I originally proposed." Mabel sat down. She took out the contract he had sent her 2 months ago, which she had read 7 times and annotated with questions in the margins. "Then let's talk about what larger means," she said. She got more than she'd hoped for. Not everything she'd asked for. Aldrich was too careful a businessman for that, but more. Enough to stay in Red Creek for 6 weeks at minimum while she produced the next batch, and a commitment to introduce her to his Denver contact in the spring. By the time she walked out of Aldrich's store, it was well past 9 o'clock, and the town was quiet except for the noise from the saloon 2 blocks over. And she was carrying a contract and a receipt and the particular bone-deep exhaustion that comes after a day that has demanded everything and then given you something back at the end of it. She found a boarding house with a room for 4 bits a night, run by a woman named Mrs. Hartley, who took one look at Mabel's muddy dress and asked no questions, which Mabel appreciated more than she could say. The room was small and cold, and the mattress had experienced better decades, and the pillow smelled of lye soap, and Mabel sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands in the light of the small lamp. Her palms were raw from the shovel and the pushing. Her knuckles were scraped, her nails were broken in 2 places. These were a seamstress's hands, which meant they were usually treated with some care. She kept them as soft as she could, because rough hands caught on fine fabric, and she had spent them today in a mud hole on a Wyoming road. She thought about the cracked brace. She needed to get that repaired tomorrow, before she used the wagon again. She thought about what it would cost. She thought about the contract. She thought about Colton Reeves saying, "I care some. But it's not my wagon." She thought about the way he had dug forward, not sideways, giving the wheel a path out instead of a deeper hole to sink into. She blew out the lamp. She lay down in the dark with her hands folded on her chest and stared at the ceiling and thought, with determination, about the contract and the 6 weeks of work ahead of her, and the Denver buyer in the spring. And not at all about the gray eyes and the real brief smile, and the way he had held his hand out, not grabbing, just present when she'd nearly fallen. She was good at not thinking about things. She closed her eyes. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved through Red Creek with a cold and careless authority, rattling the windows of the boarding house, carrying nothing with it, promising nothing. The way the West always was, beautiful and indifferent and full of roads that looked solid right up until the moment they gave way beneath you. Mabel slept. And in the morning, when she went to the wagon to check on the sewing machine and the remaining fabric, and to calculate what it would cost to have that brace repaired at the blacksmith 2 streets over, she found something she had not left there. The cracked support brace had been replaced, not patched. Replaced a new piece of wood, planed smooth, fitted exactly to the bracket, set with square-cut nails that sat flush with the frame. It was the work of someone who knew wood and knew wagons, and it had been done in the night or in the early morning before she woke, and there was no note, no message, nothing to indicate who had done it or why. Mabel stood in the cold morning air and looked at it. She put her hand on the new wood. It was solid. It was good work. Better than the original. Truth be told, the piece that had been there before had been slightly undersized, and this one was cut to the proper dimension. She stood there for a long time. She thought about the kind of person who does a thing like that. Who sees a need and fills it and leaves no indication that the filling happened. Who asks nothing for it, not gratitude, not acknowledgement, not even the knowledge that you know who did it. She had spent 11 years believing that this kind of person did not exist. That every act of help came with a price. That every hand offered was also a hand that could be used to take. She stood in the Wyoming morning, with her hand on the new wood of the repaired brace, and felt something move in her chest, a shift, a loosening, small as the first crack in river ice in early spring. Almost nothing, barely a sound. She took her hand away. She straightened her coat. She went to get Agnes from the livery and begin the day's work. But the feeling did not leave. It stayed with her through the morning and into the afternoon, quiet and persistent and impossible to name, like a note played once in a silent room that keeps sounding long after the instrument is set down. She did not know what to do with it. She had not in a very long time known what to do with kindness. The feeling stayed with her for 3 days before she did anything about it. That was how Mabel worked. She did not react quickly to things that troubled her. She let them sit, turned them over the way she turned a problem seam over in her hands, examining the angle, testing the tension, looking for where the thread was most likely to give. The repaired brace was a problem she could not solve by examining it directly, because the evidence pointed in only one direction, and that direction made her uncomfortable in ways she had not been uncomfortable in years. Someone had done something for her, without asking anything back. In 11 years she had not encountered this. She told herself there was an explanation. The blacksmith. Perhaps, though, she had not hired a blacksmith. Mrs. Hartley, the boarding house owner, who had a husband who did carpentry, though. Why he would spend a night repairing a stranger's wagon, without mentioning it to his wife, who would certainly have mentioned it to Mabel, was a logic that didn't hold. Some itinerant worker looker who hadn't found the nerve to knock, though the work was too good for someone, desperate enough, to hope for a charity payment. She told herself these things for 3 days. On the 4th morning she stopped telling herself things and walked to Aldrich's dry goods counter and said, as though it were a business inquiry, "Do you know a ranch hand named Colton Reeves? Works for a man named Burkett, land about 3 miles out on the eastern road." Aldrich looked up from his ledger. "Reeves, yes. Good man. Been with Burkett going on 5 years now, maybe 6. Why, he helped me on the road when my wagon stuck," Mabel said. "I wanted to pay him for his time. It was not entirely a lie." She did want to address the matter of the brace. She simply had not decided yet what form that address would take. "Reeves doesn't come to town much," Aldrich said. "Comes in on Saturdays for supplies, usually. Quiet man. Doesn't drink, doesn't gamble, doesn't cause trouble. Burkett would be lost without him, way I hear it." "Thank you," Mabel said, and went back to her sewing. Saturday was 2 days away. She told herself she might not bother. She told herself that on Friday night, and again on Saturday morning. And then at 10 o'clock Saturday morning, she looked up from the table. She'd set up in Aldrich's back room. He had given her working space in exchange for a reduction on her commission, which suited them both, and through the window she saw a man in a canvas duster tie a horse at the post outside and walk with the measured, unhurried pace of someone who has nowhere urgent to be into the store. And she recognized him before he'd taken 3 steps inside. He didn't see her immediately. He was at the counter talking to Aldrich about a supply order, something about fence wire and a quantity of wood screws. And she watched him from the back room doorway and thought about the new brace on her wagon and felt the particular quality of anger that is not quite anger because it is too confused to be pure. She walked out. "Mr. Reeves," she said. He turned. His expression was neutral in the way that she was coming to understand was simply how he looked, not closed off, not guarded, just quiet, the face of a man who didn't announce himself before he was ready. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "you made it to town all right." "I did." The brace held. Something very small shifted in his expression. Not guilt, not satisfaction exactly, something else. "Good to hear," he said. "I found it the morning after I arrived," she said. "The repaired one, in place of the cracked one," he said. "Was that you?" He looked at her steadily. "Does it matter who it was?" "Yes," she said, "it matters to me. I don't take things without knowing what they cost." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It cost me about 2 hours and a piece of ash wood I had spare. Didn't think it necessary to make a production of it. You should have told me why, so you could tell me not to do it." She opened her mouth and closed it, because he had identified the exact thing she would have done, and they both knew it. "I would have paid you," she said. "I didn't want payment." "Then what did you want?" He tilted his head just slightly. The same motion she'd seen on the road, a man genuinely considering a question before answering it. "I wanted the brace to be solid," he said, "before you drove that wagon on another bad road." "That's what I wanted." Mabel stood with that answer for a moment. It was too simple. It was too clean. She had been dealing with complicated people for so long that a simple answer felt like the surface of something like that road she'd driven, looking solid and giving way beneath. "I'm going to pay you anyway," she said. "What's your rate for 2 hours of work?" "Mrs. Whitaker, and I decline." His voice was still calm, still even, but something in it had gone slightly firmer, like a good fence post, giving it a small amount and then not giving any more. "I didn't do it as a transaction. I did it because it needed doing." "If you make it a transaction, you're changing what it was." She stared at him. He held her gaze without difficulty. "This bothers you," he said. "Not a challenge, just an observation." "People don't do things for nothing," she said. "You believe that." "I know that. How long have you known it?" The question was unexpected, and she did not like how quickly she found the answer. 11 years. She'd known it for 11 years, since the morning she had understood, completely, and finally, what her husband's kindnesses had actually been not kindnesses at all, but installment payments on a debt she hadn't known she was accumulating, called in when it suited him in ways she had never agreed to and could not afford. Since then, she had kept her accounts clean. She owed nothing. She was owed nothing. It was safer. Long enough, she said. Colton nodded slowly. He didn't push. He didn't try to convince her she was wrong. He said, "I'll be in town most of the morning if you want to argue about it more." And then he turned back to the counter and went on placing his order with Aldrich, like the conversation was settled. It was not settled, but Mabel went back to her sewing, and she sat with her needle and her thread and the half-finished double wedding ring spread across the table, and she sewed with the precision that had always served her better than thinking. And she thought about what it meant that he had not tried to convince her of anything. Every man who had ever wanted something from her had at some point tried to convince her of something. Her husband had been an expert at it. He could lay out a case for why his version of events was the true one, with the patience and detail of a lawyer, and she had believed him, for years, until the weight of accumulated evidence made belief impossible. The merchants who tried to lowball her rates had arguments. The townspeople who pitied her had explanations for why she should accept their charity graciously and not look so proud about it. Everyone had a case to make. Colton Reeves had said what he'd done and why, and then gone back to ordering fence wire. It was the most disorienting thing that had happened to her in years. He stopped in the doorway on his way out an hour later, with his supplies bundled and his horse untied at the post. She was aware of him without looking up from her work. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "Mr. Reeves, there's a good road north of town, solid ground even in the wet. If you're traveling north any time soon." She did not look up. "I know the road. Just mentioning. You've mentioned it." A pause, then "You sew a fine quilt." Aldrich had the flying geese one out on his counter. "Stop me for a full minute." She looked up then, because she hadn't expected that. He was looking at her directly, and the expression on his face was uncomplicated, no agenda in it that she could find, no angle she could identify. Just a man saying what he'd noticed. "Thank you," she said. It came out smaller than she intended. He touched his hat brim. Walked out. She looked back at her work and found her hands had gone still without her telling them to. The 6 weeks in Red Creek turned into 7, and then 8, because Aldrich's Denver contact arrived in town 2 weeks earlier than expected and wanted to see her work immediately and ended up extending his stay by 4 days, during which he sat in Aldrich's back room and watched Mabel sew with the focused attention of a man calculating numbers in his head, which he was. His name was Forsyth, and he was a buyer for a department store in Denver that catered to wealthy women who wanted what they called authentic frontier goods. which mostly meant they wanted things that looked handmade and told a story and cost considerably more than they had any right to cost, but that their customers bought without flinching because wealthy women in Denver had flinching money and spent it accordingly. He offered her a contract. Not the contract she would have written for herself. He was from Denver. And from Denver the terms always tilted toward the buyer, but a contract with numbers in it that meant she could settle somewhere for a full year, work steadily, stop living out of a wagon. If she wanted to stop living out of a wagon, she had been living out of a wagon for 9 years. She told Forsyth she would think about it. He gave her a week and went back to Denver. She thought about it constantly, which meant she was unable to think about anything else, which meant the week was professionally productive and personally chaotic. She sewed with mechanical precision and argued with herself in her head during every stitch. The wagon was freedom. The wagon was also cold in winter and dangerous on bad roads, and her back had opinions about it that were growing less ignorable each year. Settling meant roots. Roots meant belonging to a place. Belonging to a place meant people knowing her business, forming opinions, the slow encroachment of other people's expectations onto the life she had fought to keep clean and simple and entirely her own. It was on the 5th day of this internal war, on a Tuesday afternoon, when Aldrich had closed up early for a town meeting she had no interest in attending, that she heard boots on the back room steps and looked up and found Colton Reeves standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand and a question on his face that he hadn't quite worked out how to ask yet. She had seen him 3 more times since the Saturday at the counter. He had come in for supplies each time, and each time he had stopped to speak with her briefly, without pressure, the kind of conversation that didn't feel like it was supposed to get anywhere. He'd told her about a late-season storm coming out of the north. She'd told him about a woman in town who'd commissioned 6 chair cushions that required a particular kind of tufted work she'd had to figure out from memory. He'd listened like he was actually interested in chair cushions, which either meant he was an unusual man or a very patient one, and she was beginning to suspect both were true. Now he stood in the doorway and said, "You have a minute?" "That depends," she said, "on what you need a minute for." "There's something I want to ask you." He came in, which she noticed he always did carefully, never taking up more room than he needed to, like a man who understood that the space wasn't his. He sat in the chair across the table from her, hat resting on his knee. "I heard Forsyth made you an offer. News travels in this town," she said. "Small town, is it true? Why would that be your concern, Mr. Reeves?" He looked at her for a moment. "I've been trying to figure that out," he said honestly. "I don't have a good answer that doesn't sound like more than it is." She set down her needle. "Then tell me what it is." He turned his hat slowly in his hands. "I think you're good at your work," he said. "I think the work you do here, the quality of it, is the kind of thing that Red Creek won't see again once you're gone. Aldrich knows it. Mrs. Pullman over at the dry goods knows it. Half the women in this town have been in here asking you questions about their own sewing the past 2 months. He paused. "I think you could build something here, if you stayed." "That's not a question," she said. "That's a case you're making." "I suppose it is. You still haven't told me why it's your concern." He met her eyes, steady and direct the way he always was, without flourish. "Because I've been coming in here every Saturday for 8 weeks and finding reasons to stop and talk to you, and I reckon I ought to be honest about the fact that the fence wire stopped requiring my personal attention about 6 Saturdays ago." Mabel looked at him. "The room was very quiet, Mr. Reeves," she said carefully. "Colton," he said, "if it's all the same." "Colton." She picked her needle back up, not to sew, just to have something in her hands. "I think you're a decent man. I think what you did with the wagon brace was a genuinely kind thing." I think she stopped, recalibrated. "I am 35 years old. I have been married and I have been left and I have rebuilt my life twice from very little. And I am not in a place where I'm not asking you to be anywhere," he said. "I'm not asking anything. You said you wanted to ask something." "I was going to ask if you wanted to have supper," he said. "At the hotel dining room, just supper. That's all the asking I had in mind." She stared at him. "Supper," she repeated. Thursday evening if you're not busy. If you are busy another time, if you'd rather not, then not. She had turned down 2 supper invitations in Red Creek, already one from a feed merchant named Grover, who had the eyes of a man who considered a meal an investment with expected returns, and one from a town council member who had wanted her advice on his wife's birthday gift and thought the advice would come free with the food. She had developed an efficient system for declining that involved being already engaged with deadlines that didn't actually exist. She looked at Colton Reeves sitting across from her with his hat in his hands, and no agenda she could locate, and the memory of that new brace and the fence wire that had stopped requiring his personal attention, and the particular quality of his. Listening when she'd told him about the chair cushions. Thursday, she said, 6 o'clock. Something moved in his face, not triumph, not the particular masculine satisfaction of a man who has gotten what he was after. Something quieter than that, something closer to relief. 6 o'clock, he said, I'll be there. He stood, put his hat back on, touched the brim once, and walked out. Mabel sat very still for approximately 45 seconds. Then she picked up her needle and tried to sew and put the needle through her finger instead, which she hadn't done since she was 12 years old, and she said a word she would not have said in company. The supper on Thursday was nothing dramatic. That was the thing she would think about later, how ordinary it was, and how the ordinariness was itself the remarkable thing. The hotel dining room had 4 tables and a limited menu, and the food was decent without being remarkable, and the conversation was easy in a way that conversation was usually not easy for her. She talked about her work. He asked questions that were not the questions men usually asked, not how much she made, not how she planned to make more of it, not whether she found it difficult to travel alone. He asked what kind of fabric she liked working with most. She said wool, because wool forgave mistakes in a way cotton didn't, and he said that was interesting and asked what she meant, and she explained the elasticity, how wool stretched and recovered, how you could ease a seam that was slightly off, and the fabric would cooperate in a way that cotton resisted, and he listened to the whole explanation and said, so you can fix it without it looking fixed, and she said yes, that was exactly right, and realized she had been talking for 10 minutes about fabric behavior, and he had been paying complete attention. He told her about the ranch work, not the romance of it. She'd heard the romance of ranch work from men who'd never done it, and it rang false as a counterfeit coin, but the actual texture of it. The problems, the way cattle moved in cold weather, how the patterns of the herd could tell you what was coming before the weather did. The particular frustration of a fence line on rocky ground that needed to be reset every 2 years. The way snow changed the quality of the silence in a way that he had never been able to adequately explain to someone who hadn't heard it. You love it, she said. It's what I'm good at, he said. That's not the same thing. He considered that. No, he said. But for me, they're close enough to the same thing that the difference doesn't matter much. She thought about her own work, the needle moving through fabric, the geometry of a pattern coming together, the satisfaction of a corner that turned perfectly, a seam that lay flat and smooth with no trace of its own construction. Yes, close enough. You were married, he said, not intrusively. More the way he said most things, like he was acknowledging something that was there and not trying to pretend it wasn't. Yes, she said. Do you want to tell me about it? No, all right. And he dropped it. Completely, without qualification, without the particular male persistence of a man who thinks that no means try differently. He simply went on to the next thing, and she sat across from him and felt the rarest, strangest thing, the feeling of having been asked about something painful, and then having it not hurt. Because the person who asked had received the answer and let it be. She walked back to the boarding house alone. He had offered to walk with her, and she had said she was fine, and he had accepted that without argument, which she was beginning to understand was a pattern with him, and she stood outside Mrs. Hartley's door in the cold night air and looked at the sky, which was clear and enormous and full of stars the way the Wyoming sky got in autumn, dense with them, a recklessness of stars. She thought about supper. She thought about what it would mean to stay. She thought about Forsyth's contract. She thought about the wagon in the livery, with its new brace and its mud-seasoned frame, and the 9 years of roads it represented. She went inside. She did not decide anything that night. But she wrote a letter to Forsyth in Denver, and told him she needed 2 more weeks to decide, and she folded it and set it on the table and went to bed. And she lay in the dark and did not think about gray eyes and fence wire, and the way wool forgave mistakes, and a man who had listened to 10 minutes about fabric behavior like it mattered. She was very good at not thinking about things. She was getting worse at it. The following week was when Harrison Bellamy entered the picture, and Harrison Bellamy was the kind of man who entered every picture as though it had been waiting for him. He was 42 years old, and he owned the trading company on the main street of Red Creek, which meant he owned, in some meaningful sense, about 1/3 of the commercial activity in the town. He was tall and well-dressed by Red Creek standards, which was not Denver, but was considerably above average, with the particular confidence of a man who had never had his confidence seriously challenged. He was not unkind, he was not dishonest. He was the kind of man the town respected because he had made himself respectable. And the respect had been so thoroughly returned over so many years that he had lost any ability to distinguish between being genuinely regarded and simply being deferred to. He came to see her work on a Wednesday morning, introduced by Aldrich, which was a form of endorsement she hadn't asked for. He looked at the quilts with the careful attention of a man who had learned to look at things carefully, because knowing value was how you stayed wealthy. He asked about her process. He asked about her volume. He asked how long she intended to stay in Red Creek. She told him she was considering the Forsyth contract. He sat down, uninvited, in the chair across her table, the chair Colton sat in on Saturdays, and said, "What if there were a better offer right here in town?" Mabel looked at him. "What kind of offer?" she said. "A shop," he said, "on the main street. My building, I have a space that's been empty since the druggist moved out last spring. It would need some work, but it's a good room, good light. You'd have steady custom from day one between the women in town and the ranch families coming in for supplies. I'd waive 3 months' rent to start," he paused. "And I'd like to call on you, Mrs. Whitaker, properly. If you're amenable." She processed both halves of this simultaneously. The shop was a genuine offer. A real shop, on the main street, with a space of her own, not a rented back room, not the back of a wagon, not borrowed square footage in someone else's business. A door with her name on it, a place that was hers. The calling on her part was also genuine. She could see that. Harrison Bellamy was not a man who said things he didn't mean, because imprecision was professionally inconvenient for him. "I see," she said. "I know this is sudden," he said. "I'm not asking for an answer today. I'm simply putting the possibility in front of you." "That's very practical of you," she said, which was not quite the response he'd expected. He smiled anyway. He had a good smile, practiced, warm, the smile of a man who knew how to use it. "I'm a practical man, and I think you're a practical woman, which I find refreshing. Most people aren't. Most people can't separate what they feel from what makes sense." "And you think those are different things," she said. "In my experience," he said, "they usually are." She thought about that for the rest of the day. She thought about what it would mean to have the shop. Her own space, her own door, the stability she had been rebuilding toward for 9 years, placed directly in front of her, offered by a man who was respectable and successful, and whose offer came with no strings she could immediately identify. She thought about Colton coming in on Saturday. She thought about what she was doing. She was not a girl. She was 35 years old with a failed marriage and 9 years of roads in her bones, and she did not have the luxury of following feelings that she hadn't yet verified were going anywhere. On Saturday, when Colton came in, she could tell immediately that he already knew about Bellamy's offer. Red Creek was a small town, and Bellamy had not been quiet about it. He never was, about anything. He sat down across from her in the chair and looked at the quilt she was working on and said, "I hear Bellamy came to see you." "He did," she said. "He made an offer shop on Main Street." "His building. Just a shop? And to call on me," she said. He was direct about it. Colton looked at the quilt. His expression had shifted. Not dramatically, he was not a man given to dramatic expressions, but something had changed in the quality of the stillness. "What are you going to do?" he said. "I don't know yet." He nodded, slowly. "He's a good businessman," he said. "Solid reputation, fair man by what I've seen." The words were correct. The tone of them was the flattest she had heard from him. "You don't have to speak well of him," she said. "I'm telling you what I know." "I can see what you know without you telling me," she said. "I'm asking what you think." He looked at her directly. "I think it's a good offer, practically speaking." "And unpractically speaking?" He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to have a shape. Then he said, "I think he sees what you can do. I'm not sure he sees you." The words landed somewhere she wasn't prepared for them. "That's a significant accusation," she said quietly. "It's not an accusation. It's an observation." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, the closest he'd ever come to pressing something. "There's a difference between a man who admires what a woman is capable of and a man who knows who she is. Bellamy's been in here twice. He knows you can sew a fine quilt and you can manage a contract and you're practical enough not to cry over a mud hole. That's valuable to him. I'm not saying he's wrong." He paused. "I'm saying it's not the same thing as knowing that you talk to trouble before you fight it, or that wool matters to you because it forgives, or that your hands go still sometimes when you're thinking through something that scared you." Her hands were still right now. She was thinking through something that scared her. "How long have you been keeping track of those things?" she asked. "Since about the third Saturday," he said, "maybe the second." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the room was very quiet for a moment that neither of them moved through, because there was nowhere urgent to move to. Then she said, "I haven't told Bellamy." "Yes, I know," he said. "I haven't told him no either. I know that too." She picked up her needle. "Come back next Saturday," she said. "I'll know more by then." He stood, put his hat on, touched the brim, walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame and said, without turning around, "I'll be here." She watched him walk out into the November street, and she sat with her needle and her quilt, and the weight of what he had said, not the feeling parts of it, which she was carefully not letting herself examine yet, but the true part of it. The part that had identified something she had been trying to ignore, since Bellamy sat down across from her in that chair and said most people can't separate what they feel from what makes sense. The problem was this: she could not, looking honestly at what she felt, separate it neatly. The shop made sense. Colton made sense of a different kind. She didn't know yet which kind of sense she was brave enough to follow. She sewed. Outside, Red Creek went on being small and cold and full of people watching things they hadn't decided yet, and the Wyoming winter was coming the way. Wyoming winters always came without asking, without apologizing, changing everything by simply arriving and being exactly what it was. She had 6 days before Saturday, 6 days to figure out which kind of sense she was brave enough to follow, and she spent every one of them working, because work was the one place she had always been able to think clearly. The needle moved, the thread pulled through. The pattern came together one small stitch at a time, and she let her hands do what they knew while the rest of her argued with itself in the quiet of the back room. Harrison Bellamy came back on Monday. She had not expected him so soon. She was elbow-deep in a tufted cushion commission when she heard his voice in the front of the store, the particular carrying quality of it not loud, just accustomed to being heard, and then Aldrich was at the back room doorway saying, "Mrs. Whitaker, Mr. Bellamy's here if you have a moment," and she set down the cushion and wiped her hands on her work apron and came out. Bellamy was standing at the counter with his hat in his hand and a box on the counter that had not been there before. He smiled when he saw her, that good practiced smile that worked on most people, and that she was learning to look behind rather than at. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. "You are," she said pleasantly. "But go ahead." He laughed. He had a laugh that suggested he found directness charming in a woman, which was a different thing from actually respecting it. She noted the difference and said nothing. "I brought you something," he said, and indicated the box. She looked at the box. She looked at him. "Mr. Bellamy, I haven't given you an answer yet." "This isn't contingent on an answer," he said. "Open it." She opened it, because refusing would have been a scene and she had no interest in scenes. Inside the box was a bolt of fabric silk, deep green, the kind of quality she hadn't touched since she'd handled a commission from a wealthy rancher's wife the previous spring. It was beautiful. It was exactly the kind of fabric she would have chosen for herself if she were choosing for herself, which she never was, because silk at this quality cost more than her room for the month. She stood very still and looked at it. "I had it brought in from Laramie," Bellamy said. The merchant there said it was the finest piece he had. "I thought a woman who works with fabric the way you do might appreciate something she wouldn't ordinarily buy for herself." It was a perceptive gift. That was the problem with it. He had paid enough attention to understand what would move her, and he had used that attention to bring her something she could not easily refuse without seeming ungracious. And she could see the whole architecture of it clearly, and still felt the pull of the silk under her fingertips when she touched it. "It's beautiful," she said, "and I can't accept it." The smile didn't waver, but something behind it adjusted. "May I ask why?" "Because I haven't made a decision yet, and accepting a gift of this value before I have suggested direction, I'm not prepared to confirm." She closed the box, pushed it gently back toward him across the counter. "When I've made my decision, Mr. Bellamy, I'll tell you directly. Until then, I'd ask that you let me make it without assistance of this kind." A pause. Bellamy looked at the box, then at her. "You're a very unusual woman, Mrs. Whitaker. So I've been told. I meant it as a compliment." "I know you did," she said. "Good morning, Mr. Bellamy." He picked up the box. He was too experienced a man to show irritation he had bought, and sold enough things to know that a price that doesn't move today sometimes moves tomorrow. He put his hat on, inclined his head, walked out. Aldrich appeared from the back, where he had been making himself busy with paperwork during the entirety of this exchange. He had the look of a man who had heard everything, and was working very hard at appearing not to have heard anything. "That bolt of silk was worth $30, he said. "I know what it was worth," Mabel said, and went back to the cushion. But her hands were not steady for the next hour, and she knew it was not because of Bellamy. It was because of what the gift had revealed, that he was watching her carefully enough to know what she wanted. And she was not sure she was comfortable being known that precisely by a man she had not chosen to let in. Colton had noticed the still hands. The thought arrived without invitation, and she put it away. Tuesday passed Wednesday. She finished the cushion commission and started a new quilt, a star pattern that required precise geometry, and gave her no room to let her attention wander, which was exactly why she chose it. She talked to Mrs. Hartley over breakfast about nothing consequential. She took her meals at the boarding house to avoid the dining room at the hotel, which was Bellamy's territory, in the sense that he was always there and always visible and always nodded to her, with the patient confidence of a man who had learned that patience was the most effective negotiating tool. On Thursday, a woman named Clara Voss came to the back room. Clara Voss was 38, a rancher's wife who had driven 12 miles into town because she'd heard about the seamstress working at Aldrich's. And she stood in the doorway with a dress bundled under her arm and an expression that mixed hope and embarrassment in the proportions of someone who was not accustomed to asking for help. "Mrs. Whitaker," she said, "I'm sorry to bother you. They said you might be able to. My daughter's getting married in 3 weeks, and the dress is—" She held it up. It was a white dress, pretty enough, but the bodice had been let out and re-let out until the seam lines were a testament to good intentions and poor execution. "I've been trying to fix it myself, but I keep making it worse." Mabel took the dress, examined the bodice seams, turned it, looked at the structure underneath. "Sit down," she said. "Tell me what size your daughter is now." Clara sat, she told her. They talked for 20 minutes about the dress, about the wedding, about Clara's daughter Ruth, who had grown 2 inches since the dress was bought, and whose figure had changed in the way of young women on the verge of their lives. Mabel took measurements, made notes, laid the dress out on the table, and showed Clara exactly what she was going to do and why. Clara looked at her across the fabric and said, "Can I ask you something that isn't about the dress?" "You can ask," Mabel said. "Are you going to stay in Red Creek?" She said it with the directness of a woman who had driven 12 miles and didn't have time to approach things indirectly. Because if you opened a proper shop, there are 6 women I know personally who would be regular customers within the month. Ranch families, mostly. Women who can sew a work shirt but not a wedding dress, who need alterations and repairs, and sometimes just someone who knows what they're doing. Mabel looked at her. "You've been talking to people," she said. "Word gets around," Clara said without apology. "Are you staying?" "I'm considering it." "Consider faster," Clara said. "Ruth's wedding is in 3 weeks," Mabel almost laughed. The almost escaped and became an actual laugh, brief, surprised, the kind that happened when something caught her off guard, and Clara Voss grinned across the table, and Mabel thought that this was what she had been missing for 9 years of Rhodes. Not just stability, this particular human texture, a woman driving 12 miles for her daughter's wedding dress, the straightforward warmth of a request made with no agenda beyond what it was. "Leave the dress," Mabel said. "I'll have it right by Tuesday." Clara stood, shook her hand with the firm grip of a woman who worked outside, and said, "I'll bring the other 5 women with me when I come to pick it up." She did. On Tuesday, Clara arrived with 5 women ranging in age from 22 to 64, and the back room of Aldrich's dry goods was fuller than it had ever been. And they all talked over each other about buttons and hem lengths, and a coat that needed its collar replaced, and a baby quilt that was wanted for a nephew due in February. And Mabel sat in the center of it, and took measurements, and wrote down numbers, and felt, with a clarity that was almost physical, what it would mean to have a room of her own where this could happen every week. She thought about the shop. She thought about Bellamy's smile. She thought about the difference between a man who knew what you wanted and a man who knew who you were. Friday came. Colton always came on Saturday. She had been counting on Saturday. She needed one more day to settle the thing that had been shifting in her chest all week, to put it into some form she could examine and decide about. Because she was not the kind of woman who made decisions from the middle of feelings, she made them from the far side, where she could see the whole shape. Friday afternoon, when the light was going pale, and she was alone in the back room with Clara's daughter's dress, which was coming along beautifully, she heard boots on the back steps and knew them before she saw him. He stood in the doorway on a Friday, not Saturday. She looked up. "You're a day early," she said. "I know." He came in. He did not sit down this time. He stood with his hat in his hands, turning it the way he did when he was working out what to say, and she put down the dress and waited, because she could see that something had shifted in him. Something that had been patient and measured had reached a point it couldn't hold past. "Bellamy's telling people," he said. "Not officially. But the way a man tells things, when he wants them known, without being accountable for having said them. He's talking about the shop. He's talking about calling on you." A pause. "He's talking about it like it's settled." Mabel felt cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. "He doesn't have an answer for me," she said. "I know that." "Then what he's saying is..."
"A man laying claim to something he expects to acquire," Colton said.
His voice was still quiet, but there was something beneath the quiet now. "I've seen him do it with property. He decides he wants a thing and he starts treating it as his before the papers are signed. Because by the time the papers are in front of you, half the town already thinks of it as his, and backing out feels like something is being taken, rather than something being returned." Mabel stared at him. "Are you telling me," she said slowly, "that Harrison Bellamy is doing to me what he does with real estate?" "I'm telling you what I've seen. That is a very significant thing to tell someone." "Yes," he said, "it is. Why are you telling it to me today instead of tomorrow?" He met her eyes, because tomorrow might be too late to matter. The room was very still. Somewhere in the front of the store, Aldrich was moving boxes. Outside on the street, a wagon passed. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary Friday in Red Creek, and in the back room, none of it touched what was happening. "Colton," she said. "Mabel." It was the first time he had used her given name, and they both noticed it, and neither of them addressed it. "I'm not telling you who to choose. This isn't me making a case for myself, or not only that. I'm telling you because you deserve to know how the board is being arranged before you decide you want to play." She stood up from the table. She walked to the small window that looked out on the alley behind Aldrich's store, and she stood there with her back to him for a moment, because she needed a moment. Because what he had told her had rearranged something, and she needed to see where the pieces fell. Bellamy had been in here twice. He had brought silk. He had been patient and strategic, and he had started telling people a story she hadn't agreed to be in, and she had not seen it, because she had been so focused on the practical parts of his offer: the shop, the location, the 3 months of waived rent, that she had not looked at what was underneath the practical parts. She turned around. "Tell me something," she said, "and tell me the truth." "I've been telling you the truth," he said. "Tell me why you came here today, instead of letting me walk into tomorrow not knowing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I watched someone arrange your life for you once before, and it cost you 11 years of carrying everything alone. And I don't know if I'm what you want, or if I'm what's good for you, or if any of what I feel about you is the right call. But I know that you deserve to make your own choice. Not someone else's version of it dressed up to look like yours." She heard 11 years of carrying everything alone, and felt it land exactly where he had aimed it, in the place she had kept sealed since Ohio, since a man who had known what she wanted without knowing who she was had used that knowledge, methodically, to take everything she'd given him and leave. Her eyes were dry. They stayed dry. She did not cry in front of people. She had not cried in front of a person in 11 years. But her voice, when it came, was smaller than she wanted it to be. "How do you know about the marriage?" "I don't," he said. "Not the particulars. I know what 11 years of trusting no one looks like, because I know what it looks like to carry something that heavy. And I know you've been carrying it since before I met you." She looked at him across the table with Clara Voss's daughter's wedding dress between them, and she thought about the wagon brace and the fence wire and the 10 minutes about fabric behavior, and "I don't love you despite everything you are," and she stopped that thought before it completed itself, because that was what he had said at the hotel dinner 3 weeks ago, quietly, while she was looking at the menu, and she had been not thinking about it ever since. "You said something," she said, "at the hotel 3 weeks ago." He waited. She stopped. "You said you don't love me despite everything I am." "You said because of." He didn't look away. "I meant it." "You've known me 9 weeks, I know," he said. I know it's fast. "I know you have every reason not to trust it." "I have every reason not to trust anything," she said. "Yes, you do." He took a step toward the table. 1 step, no more, leaving the distance between them still considerable. "Mabel, I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm not asking you to believe it. I'm asking you not to take Bellamy's offer before he stopped. Revised. Before you've asked yourself what you actually want. Not what's practical, not what makes the most sense on paper. What you actually want." The question sat in the room. What she actually wanted. She had asking herself that question 11 years ago, on the morning she'd understood that wanting things led to giving a man the precise information he needed to take them from her. She had become practical because practicality was armor. She had built a life from practicality, and it was a good life, a life she was proud of, and she was not apologizing for it. But practicality was not the same thing as not wanting. She had known that for 9 weeks, roughly, and had been refusing to look at it directly. "I need you to leave," she said. She put her hand flat on the table. "I need to think. Without you in the room." He picked up his hat. "I know. Come back tomorrow," she said. "Saturday." "Like you usually do." He nodded, walked to the door. Stopped, one hand on the frame, his back to her, and said, "For what it's worth, and I know it may not be worth much right now, I'm not going anywhere. Whatever you decide. I'm not going to make this difficult for you." He walked out. She stood in the back room alone with the wedding dress and the failing light and the question he had left behind, and she breathed through it slow, deliberate, the way she breathed through everything that threatened to undo her, and she sat back down, and she picked up the dress and she sewed. She sewed for 3 hours. She was very nearly done with the bodice when she heard Bellamy's voice in the front of the store. It was after 6. Aldrich was still there later than usual. She heard Bellamy's voice, and then Aldrich's, lower, and then the sound of the door and Aldrich's footsteps toward the back. He appeared in the doorway, with an expression she could not immediately read. "Bellamy wants to speak with you," he said. "He says it's important." "Tell him I'm working, Mabel." Aldrich was a man who used her first name approximately twice a year, always in the context of something he considered urgent. "He's asking people about you, about your situation." "Your history." She set the dress down. "My history," she said. "Your marriage in Ohio." Aldrich looked genuinely uncomfortable. "He's been writing letters, I don't know who to. But I think he knows something." The cold came back, deeper this time. She had left Ohio 11 years ago, and she had not looked back, and she had not told anyone what she had left, or why or what name she had held before she went back to Whitaker, her mother's name. The name she had taken back along with everything else she had taken back in the slow grinding process of rebuilding a life from what her husband had left her. She had not told anyone. She had been careful. She had moved enough times through enough states that the trail was thin. She had not thought to be careful in Red Creek, because she had not planned to stay long enough for it to matter. She stood. She walked out to the front of the store. Bellamy was there, hat in hand, the practiced smile in place, and she looked at him, really looked at him, the way she had not been doing, the way she had been looking at his offer instead, and she saw it clearly for the first time. What Colton had described, the arrangement of pieces. The expectation of acquisition, the particular confidence of a man who had decided what he was going to have. "Mr. Bellamy," she said. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "Mabel, what did you find out?" she said. "About Ohio." Something shifted in his face. Not guilt. She didn't think this man experienced guilt in the conventional sense. "Something closer to recalculation. I have contacts," he said carefully. "I do business across several states. When I have an interest in something or someone, I like to understand what I'm dealing with. It's nothing personal." "What did you find out?" she said again. Her voice was flat and very steady, the way it was when she was dealing with something serious. He looked at her. "Your husband is still alive," he said. "And you left before the divorce was finalized. In Ohio, legally, you're still—" "I am aware of my own legal situation," she said, and her voice did not shake, which was a significant achievement. "I'm not bringing it up to cause trouble," he said quickly. "I'm bringing it up because I think, with the right arrangement, it could be resolved. I have a lawyer in Cheyenne. It would be simple, straightforward." "And in exchange," she said. He stopped. "You investigated my private history without my knowledge," she said. "You found something you believed gave you leverage. And you are now offering to use your resources to resolve my situation in exchange for what, exactly? My agreement to your proposal? My dependency on your help?" The smile had gone entirely now. "That's not, because what you've just described," she said, "is not a proposal. It's a transaction. You want to buy my gratitude and my reliance, and you want to use my history to make sure I can't easily refuse." She looked at him directly. "I've been in a situation like this before, Mr. Bellamy. I know exactly what it looks like." Aldrich had stopped pretending to do anything else. Bellamy's expression had gone the particular flat color of a man whose plan has not played out as expected and who is not sure how to adapt. "You're being uncharitable," he said. "I was trying to help." "You were trying to put me in a position where I needed your help," she said. "Those are different things. I know the difference." She turned and walked back to the storeroom. She could hear him behind her, saying something else, her name, an explanation, the particular persistence of a man who is not accustomed to losing a negotiation, and she closed the back room door behind her, not slamming it, just closing it. The decisive click of a latch that had made its mind up. She stood alone in the room with the wedding dress, and her heart going hard and fast in her chest. She had done it again. She had nearly done it again. She had been so focused on the practicality of the offer, the shop, the stability, the numbers on the page, that she had not seen what was underneath until someone had stood in this room the previous night and told her to look at the board before she agreed to play. She sat down, she breathed. She thought about the lawyer in Cheyenne. She thought about Ohio, about the man she had turned to, about the not quite finalized divorce that had followed her like a shadow she had gotten good at not looking at. It was true. She had known it was probably true. The process had been abandoned before completion, in the chaos of leaving, and she had moved and moved and moved again, and told herself it could be dealt with, when she was somewhere safe enough to deal with it. And she had not yet been somewhere safe enough, or she had not let herself believe she was. Red Creek had started to feel safe. She thought about that. She thought about what Colton had said, not asking you to trust me. Asking you not to take Bellamy's offer before you've asked yourself what you actually want. What she wanted, she realized, sitting in the back room with the clarity that comes after something breaks open, was not the shop in Bellamy's building. What she wanted was a room of her own with her name on the door that she had earned herself on her own terms, with no one's leverage attached to it. What she wanted, and this was the part she had been refusing to look at directly for 9 weeks, was to stop moving. What she wanted was Saturday. The next morning she went to see a man named Patterson, who was Red Creek's single attorney, a young man, younger than she'd hoped, but competent-looking, with an organized desk and a sharp way of listening. She told him her situation, all of it. The marriage, the abandonment, the departure, the incomplete paperwork. She watched his face while she talked, and it did not change into pity, which was the thing she dreaded most, or judgment, which was the second thing. It changed into attention. The divorce was filed, he said when she finished. Just not completed, as far as I know. That's a different problem than no divorce at all, he said. The filing exists on record in Ohio. We can work with that. I'll write to the court. He looked at her over his desk. Mrs. Whitaker, how long have you been carrying this around? 11 years, she said. He nodded. Let's put it down, he said, and picked up his pen. She walked out of Patterson's office into the November street and stood for a moment in the cold air, with the particular feeling of a woman who has just done the thing she has been postponing for 11 years and found that it was survivable. Better than survivable. The weight of it, she realized, had been so constant for so long that she had stopped feeling it as weight. She had simply built her whole structure around it and called it her shape. She went back to Aldrich's. She sewed through the morning. At noon, she walked to the trading company on Main Street and told the manager at the counter that she wished to see the empty space that Mr. Bellamy owned, the one next door, the druggist's old room. The manager looked at her. Mr. Bellamy and I are not in any arrangement, she said. I want to look at the room. If there's a rental available, I'll speak to the landlord directly. The room was good. It was a good room, solid walls, 2 south-facing windows that caught the light she needed for fine work, space enough for a cutting table and a sewing station, and 4 chairs for customers waiting. It smelled of old wood and the ghost of pharmaceuticals and potential. She stood in it and looked at the windows and thought about her name on the door. Not Bellamy's name, not a man's name, hers. She walked back out and asked the manager who actually held the deed. The deed, it turned out, was not Bellamy's. It was owned by a widow named Mrs. Crane, who lived in Laramie and had been renting to Bellamy for 10 years and would be very happy, the manager told her after consulting a letter that had apparently existed for some time, to rent directly to a commercial tenant of good standing if one presented itself. Mabel wrote to Mrs. Crane that afternoon. She was still writing when Saturday came. Colton arrived at his usual time. She heard him come in. She heard him talking to Aldrich briefly. She heard his boots on the back steps and the particular way he paused before the door. Come in, she said before he knocked. He came in. He looked at her across the table. Whatever he was expecting, her expression was apparently not it, because his settled into the careful stillness of a man reading something he wants to read correctly. You went to see Patterson, he said. Word travels, she said. Is that all right? It's fine. It needed doing 11 years ago. She put down the letter. She was finishing a second one, to Forsyth in Denver, declining his contract. I'm staying in Red Creek. He was very still. Bellamy. I ended that conversation on Friday night, she said. He knew something about my past and tried to use it, and I showed him the door. She folded the letter. I found out who actually owns the room next to the trading company. I've written to the landlord in Laramie about a direct rental." Something moved in Colton's face. Not triumph. She would have liked it less if it had been triumph. It was something much quieter, a kind of letting out of a breath he had been holding carefully for a long time. "Mabel," he said. "I know," she said. "I wasn't going to—" "I know you weren't." She looked at him across Clara's daughter's almost finished wedding dress, and she thought about wool forgiving mistakes, and new wood on an old wagon frame, and a man who came back every Saturday for the fence wire. "I have a question for you." "All right," he said. "What did you mean," she said carefully, "when you said you don't love me despite everything I am?" He didn't look away. "I meant that the parts you think are problems," he said. "The size of you, the history of you. The part that won't ask for help, and keeps accounts of every kindness and still flinches when someone reaches too close. Those are not things I'm willing to overlook. They're what I see when I look at you, all of it at once. I don't want you without those parts." He paused. "I don't think you'd be Mabel without those parts." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is a very serious thing to say to someone," she said. "I'm a serious man, I know you are," she said. She folded her hands on the table. "I'm not ready," she said. "I want you to know that. Whatever this is, I need time. I need to deal with Ohio, and I need to get my room, and I need some things to be mine, solidly and clearly mine, before I can think about anything else." "That's fair," he said. "I'm telling you because I want you to understand it's not a no." Something shifted in him, subtle, deep, the way the ground shifts in early spring under still frozen surface. "I hear you," he said, "and I'm telling you." She stopped. The words were harder. She made herself say them. "I'm telling you that what you said on Friday mattered. The part about the board, the part about choosing for myself." She looked at her hands. "Nobody has said something like that to me in a very long time. If ever." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I'll be here. Next Saturday. The one after. Whenever you're ready to talk further. And if it takes a while, Mabel," he said, and in the way he said her name she heard the whole of the answer. "I fixed a wagon brace in the middle of the night without telling you. I think we've established I'm comfortable with patience." She looked at him. He looked at her. And something in Mabel Whitaker, something that had been sealed since Ohio, since a man who'd known what she wanted had used it against her. Something that had survived 11 years of roads and cold mornings, and carrying everything alone, something shifted. Not breaking, not collapsing, moving, the way a door moves when the latch releases. The way wool eases into a seam when the tension is exactly right. She did not say anything else, neither did he. He picked up his hat, touched the brim, walked out. She sat in the quiet back room with the wedding dress and the 2 folded letters and the particular sound of a woman who has been running for 11 years, putting down, one careful piece at a time, the things she no longer needs to carry alone. Outside, Red Creek continued to be small and cold and ordinary. Inside, everything had changed. The letter from Mrs. Crane arrived on a Wednesday, 11 days after Mabel had written it. She was in the middle of hemming a coat when Aldrich brought it back to her. And she set down the coat and opened it with the particular care of someone who has learned that paper can contain either rescue or devastation, and that the difference is not always obvious from the outside. Mrs. Crane's handwriting was small and precise, the penmanship of a woman who had written a great many letters and had opinions about how it should be done. She read it once, then again. Mrs. Crane was agreeable to a direct rental arrangement. The terms she named were lower than what Bellamy had been charging for the sublease, considerably lower, as it turned out, which told Mabel something about the margin Bellamy had been collecting on the arrangement and what he had considered a fair profit on another person's property. Mrs. Crane wanted first and last month in advance, a signed agreement, and a reference from a local merchant of standing. She would send a formal contract within the fortnight. Mabel set the letter down on the table. She sat with it for approximately 30 seconds. Then she stood up, walked to the front of the store, and said, "Mr. Aldrich, I need to ask you for a reference." Aldrich put down his pencil. "For the Crane property?" "Yes." He looked at her for a moment, the look of a man who is performing a calculation that involves more than numbers. Then he opened his desk drawer, took out a sheet of his own letterhead, and said, "Sit down." "Tell me what you needed to say," she told him. He wrote it. He was a better writer than she would have expected, with a directness in his phrasing that she recognized as the particular eloquence of a man who had learned to be honest in business because dishonesty was too expensive. He called her work exceptional. He called her a person of integrity. He said, in the last line, that any arrangement she entered would be better for her presence in it. She read it. She looked up at him. "This is more than I asked for." "It's what I observed," he said. She took it. She sent it to Laramie with the afternoon post along with the first and last month's payment, which represented nearly everything she had in hand, from the Forsyth contract deposit she had kept when she'd declined. And she walked back to Aldrich and sat down and finished hemming the coat, and did not allow herself to think about what would happen if Mrs. Crane changed her mind. She was not going to think about what she couldn't control. She was going to hem the coat. Patterson sent word the following week that he had located the original divorce filing in Ohio. It existed. It was on record. The fault grounds had been properly established. And the abandonment of the proceedings had been Mabel's husband's doing rather than hers, which meant the record was in her favor. It would take 2 to 3 months to finalize through correspondence, he said, but the legal situation was navigable and she should not worry. She sat in his office and heard him say she should not worry, and felt the specific exhaustion of 11 years of worrying about precisely this thing. A weight she had carried so constantly that she had calibrated her entire life around it without realizing she was doing it. "Thank you," she said. And then, because she had not said this to anyone in a professional context in as long as she could remember, "I should have done this years ago." Patterson looked at her over his desk with the particular kindness of a young man who has not yet had his kindness worn away. "People do things when they're ready," he said. "You're here now." She was here now. She walked out into the cold December street and thought about that. She was here, in Red Creek, with a reference sent to Laramie and a filing in Ohio and a Saturday coming that she had been, if she was being honest with herself, looking forward to with an intensity she did not know what to do with. She was still figuring out what to do with it when Clara Voss came back on Tuesday with the 5 ranch women she had promised, and also Ruth, her daughter, who was 20 years old and had cried when she saw what Mabel had done to the wedding dress. Not unhappy crying. The other kind, the kind that meant something had been fixed that the person hadn't been sure could be fixed. "It's perfect," Ruth said, and her voice broke on the last word, and she put her hand over her mouth and laughed at herself for crying. Mabel had looked at the girl and thought about 20 years old, about what she had believed at 20, about the long distance between that belief and what she now knew. And she had felt something that was not quite envy and not quite grief, but lived in the neighborhood of both a tenderness for the girl's certainty, for the uncomplicated happiness of a dress that fit, and a wedding in 3 weeks, and a life that had not yet been complicated by the things that complicated lives. "Don't cry," Mabel said. "You'll need steady hands to get into it." Ruth laughed again, steadier this time. "How much do I owe you?" Mabel named a price that was fair, not cheap, because she had learned that undervaluing her work was a habit born from insecurity and not one she intended to keep. Ruth's face didn't flicker. She counted out the coins without complaint, and Clara behind her gave Mabel the particular nod of one capable woman to another, the nod that said she had done right. The other 5 women placed orders. 3 alterations, 1 new dress commission, and 1 request for a baby quilt in blue and yellow that made Mabel's fingers itch with the pleasure of pattern planning. She wrote everything down, shook 5 hands, and stood in Aldrich's back room after they had gone and looked at her order book and thought about the room on Main Street and what it would mean to have a door to close behind her at the end of the day that was her own. Saturday came. Colton came in with the snow. The first real snow of the season had started that morning, not a storm, just a steady, silent fall that made Red Creek quieter and somehow closer, the way snow always compressed the world to the distance you could see. He came in shaking it off his hat, and she heard him at the front talking to Aldrich, and she felt herself go still, in that particular way she had identified and was trying to stop being embarrassed by. He came to the back room. He looked at the order book open on the table, the new names, the new commissions. He looked at her. "Good week," he said. "Very good week," she said. Mrs. Crane wrote, "The rental is agreed." He looked at her steadily. "When do you get the keys?" 2 weeks, when the formal contract arrives." "I can be in the room by the new year." He sat down. His expression was doing the thing it did when something had moved in him that he was deciding how to hold. "That's yours," he said, "that room, with your name on it." "With my name on it," she confirmed. "How does that feel?" Nobody had asked her that. Patterson had given her information. Aldrich had given her a reference. Clara Voss had given her business. Nobody had asked how it felt. She considered it honestly. "Terrifying," she said, "and exactly right." He nodded. "Those two usually go together. So I'm discovering." She poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot she kept on the small stove in the corner. She had set up the stove 2 weeks into her stay. Because she was not a woman who suffered cold hands when she had any say about it, and she set one in front of him and sat down with the other, and the ordinary domesticity of it moved through her without her permission. The simple rightness of 2 cups of coffee on a winter Saturday. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right." "About Ohio. About why I left and what I left." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. Said nothing. Waited. She had not told this story to anyone. In 11 years she had not told it, not in full, not with all the pieces in the right order, not the way it actually went, rather than the abbreviated version she carried, like a practiced deflection. She had told people she was widowed, which was easier. She had told people she was divorced, when that seemed more useful. She had told Patterson the facts, because he was her lawyer and needed them. She had never told anyone the shape of it, what it had been like from the inside, the slow comprehension of what her husband actually was, the way understanding had arrived not in a single revelation but in a series of small discoveries, each one reshuffling what she thought she knew. Until one morning she woke up and saw it all at once, and understood that she had been living inside a fiction he had constructed, and that the fiction was not going to become true no matter how long she waited. She told Colton. Not all of it, there were parts that still lived in a place she wasn't ready to open, but the structure of it. The marriage at 22, the man who had known exactly what to say to a woman who wanted to be known, the years of a life she had believed was real, the slow discovery that his kindness had always been a currency he was collecting interest on. The morning she had found the letters he had written to another woman in another state, letters that made clear that Mabel's version of their life had been entirely different from his. The leaving, the taking back of her mother's name. The road, she talked for a long time. He listened for the whole of it. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. Then he knew what you wanted. Yes, and he used it very efficiently, she said. He was a practical man. She watched Colton's face while he processed that, the things moving through his expression, that he didn't bother to conceal anger, she thought, and a kind of sorrow, and something else. Something that looked like understanding in the deepest and most careful sense of the word. "That's why the brace bothered you," he said. She looked at him. "That's why a simple act of help without payment, without any kind of accounting, was the most disorienting thing I could have done." He said it without accusation. "Just working it out. Because you'd learned that kindness without visible price is the most dangerous kind." She had not put it in those words, but yes, she said. "And you still let me help with the wheel," he said. "I was angry about it for 3 days, I know." The corner of his mouth moved. "I reckon I knew it at the time, too. That's why I didn't make a production of the brace." She looked at him. "You were being careful with me." "I was being honest," he said. "The brace needed fixing." "I fixed it. Everything else I left to you." He paused. "I was always going to leave it to you." There it was again, that loosening, that shift in something that had been sealed so long. She had mistaken the seal for her own skin. She picked up her coffee cup to have something to do with her hands. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "Do what?" "This." She gestured vaguely at the space between them. The cups, the table, the particular quality of a December Saturday in a warm back room. I haven't in 11 years I haven't let anyone closest enough to I don't know if I remember how. You're doing it right now, he said quietly. She looked at him. Telling me that story, he said. That's doing it. She was quiet for a moment. It scares me, she said. It cost her something to say it. She was not a woman who admitted fear easily. I know, he said. It should probably. It would scare anyone with sense. He set down his coffee. Mabel, I'm not in a hurry. I told you that, I meant it. What if I'm too damaged, she said. What if 11 years of carrying everything alone has made me? She stopped. Tried again. What if I've spent so long being the only person I rely on that I don't know how to make room? Then we figure it out, he said, slowly, the same way you figured out the wagons and the roads and the contracts. One problem at a time. She stared at him. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, he said, but it's not impossible either. Most things that look impossible are just slow. She thought about the brace. New wood fitted exactly, set with square-cut nails. Slow work done in the dark. Something fixed that she hadn't known could be fixed until it already was. She looked at this man across the table from her, and felt with a clarity that was almost painful that she was at the edge of something. Not a cliff. She had stood at cliffs before, and this was not that quality of vertiginous fear. More like the edge of winter into spring. The ground still frozen, the air still cold, but something underneath beginning to move, to loosen, to remember that it knew how to be something other than hard. Next Saturday, she said. I'll be here, and the one after. Yes, and there will be days when I need you farther away than you're standing, she said. Not because of you, because I know, he said. I'll read the distance. I've been reading it since that road. She believed him. That was the most remarkable thing. She believed him, and she could not have said entirely why, except that 11 weeks of watching a man do exactly what he had and say exactly what he meant had accumulated into something that she could not call by any other name. She believed him. 2 weeks later, the key to the room on Main Street arrived with the signed contract from Laramie. Mabel held it in her palm, a plain iron key, nothing remarkable. The kind of key that opened the kind of door, that opened onto the kind of ordinary room, that was about to become the most important place she had ever occupied, and she stood in the middle of Aldrich's back room and felt the weight of it against her skin and thought, this is mine. Not a husband's, not a merchant's, not a man who had decided she was an acquisition worth making. Hers. She spent 3 days cleaning the room before she moved anything into it. She scrubbed the floor on her hands and knees, which was undignified, and she did not care, because a floor she had scrubbed herself was a floor she had taken ownership of. She repaired a gap in the window casing that was letting in cold air. She built the cutting table herself from lumber she bought at the hardware store, following a design she had worked out on paper over 2 evenings. And when it was done, it was exactly the right height and exactly the right depth. And she stood back and looked at it and felt something she hadn't felt in so long. She had almost forgotten the word for it. Pride, not the armored kind, not the pride that was really a refusal to be broken. The plain, simple kind. I made this. It is mine. It is good. Colton appeared on moving day without being asked. She had not asked him. He had not offered. He simply appeared at 7 in the morning at the door of Aldrich's store with a borrowed wagon and a calm expression that said he had thought about whether this was welcome and decided to risk it. And she stood in the doorway and looked at him and said, the cutting table's the heaviest piece. I figured, he said, and took his coat off and rolled his sleeves up, and they moved her things from Aldrich's back room to the room on Main Street in 3 hours. Working with the particular efficiency of 2 people who understood each other's movements. By now she directed, he lifted, neither of them spoke more than the work required. And the silence was not empty but full of a texture she was still learning to trust. When the last piece was in place and the sewing machine was set up by the south window, and the cutting table stood solid in the middle of the room, she turned around and looked at all of it together and felt the thing she had been waiting to feel, the clicking into place of something that had been misaligned. For so long she had stopped noticing it. Well, Colton said from behind her, Well, she said. Looks like a shop. It does, looks like yours. She turned. He was standing by the door with his coat back on and his hat in his hands, and the same expression he always had, that steady, unstemontre look that she now understood was not absence of feeling, but rather the concentrated presence of it. Held carefully, because he had learned that held things last longer than spilled ones. Thank you, she said, moving furniture. Not just the furniture, she said. And she let him hear what she meant by it. Something moved in his face, deep and real and not concealed this time. He looked at her across the new room and said, "You're welcome, Mabel," and the way he said her name had the quality of something handled with both hands. She opened the shop on the 2nd of January. She had made a sign herself, painted letters on a board she had sanded smooth, Whitaker sewing alterations, commissions, repairs. Simple. Her name first, nothing that didn't need to be there. Clara Voss arrived at 8 in the morning with Ruth and 2 other ranch women, and by 10 o'clock Mabel had taken 4 orders. By noon the word had moved through the small channels of Red Creek, the way news moved in small towns through wives and sisters, and the conversations that happened between the dry goods store and the post office, and by the end of the first week. She had more work than she could complete alone, which was a problem of the best kind. Bellamy did not come in. She had expected in some part of herself that he would try again, that he was the kind of man who revisited negotiations until they were conclusively closed. But he did not come, and when she saw him on the street, he inclined his head with the precise courtesy of a man who has lost a negotiation and understands that is what has happened, and she inclined hers in return, and that was the end of it. She did not waste time resenting him. He had shown her something about herself, about what she could not see when she was looking at a practical offer, and that was in its way useful. Patterson sent a letter in February. The Ohio court had processed the filing. The decree was finalized. She was legally and entirely Mabel Whitaker, a free woman in all the senses that the law could make a person free. She read the letter at the cutting table in her shop on a Tuesday morning, the winter light coming through the south window, the way she had known it would, and she folded it carefully and put it in the wooden box that lived under her counter, next to her contracts and her money, and she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the cutting table and breathed. Done. 11 years of running from a thing that the law had all along been capable of resolving. She had been afraid to stop long enough to let it be resolved. She had not trusted that stopping was safe. She had not trusted that any ground she stood on would hold. She thought about the road outside Red Creek, the ground that had looked solid and given way. She thought about Colton digging forward instead of sideways, giving the wheel a channel out, not a deeper hole. She thought about what it meant to be dug out of something by the right kind of help. She was still sitting there when the shop door opened, and she looked up, and it was not a customer. It was a woman she had never seen before, 50 or so, well dressed for travel, with a face that had a quality Mabel recognized immediately and uneasily. The face of someone who had been sending letters and had now decided that letters were not sufficient. "Mrs. Whitaker," the woman said. "Or I suppose it's still Whitaker." I wasn't sure. "Who are you?" she said. Her voice was level. Her hands were flat on the cutting table. "My name is Dorothea Phelps," the woman said. "My brother was Edmund Whitaker." She paused. "Your husband." The cold came, the specific deep cold that had nothing to do with January. "Was," Mabel said. The word caught on something. Dorothea Phelps looked at her with an expression that was not hostile, was in fact closer to exhausted, the look of a woman who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has come to put it down somewhere. "He died in October," she said. "It was not quick." She paused. "I know this is a shock." Mabel stood very still. Edmund was dead. The man she had left, the man she had been afraid of, in the diffuse way you were afraid of a document that could surface at the wrong moment, the man whose name she had shed like a coat she couldn't afford to keep gone. Since October. She had been here in Red Creek getting her shop and her key and her decree, and he had been dying in Ohio, and she had not known. "Why did you come?" Mabel said. Her voice was very quiet. Dorothea Phelps opened the traveling bag she carried and took out an envelope. He left something for you, she said, in his will. I won't pretend he was a good husband to you. He wasn't. I knew some of what he was, and I didn't. I should have said something years ago, and I didn't, and I'm sorry for that. She set the envelope on the cutting table. He left you the house in Columbus. I don't know why. Maybe he knew what he owed you. Maybe it was guilt. I can't speak to what he meant. I can only deliver what he wrote. Mabel looked at the envelope. She did not pick it up immediately. The house, she said. Free and clear, it's yours if you want it. If you don't, you can sell it. I've taken everything out of it that was family property, his mother's furniture, his books. What's left is the structure and the land. She paused. It's worth something. Not a fortune, but something. Mabel stood in her shop on Main Street in Red Creek, Wyoming, in January of 1885. With the south light on her cutting table and a sign on her door with her name on it, and a deed from a dead man in an envelope on the table between her and the sister of the man who had taken 11 years from her. And she felt the complete strangeness of the world, its refusal to be simple, its insistence on complicating things just when you had gotten the shape of them clear. I'll need time to think about the house, she said. Of course, Dorothea picked up her bag. I'm at the hotel for 2 days. You can send word. She walked to the door, stopped. Mrs. Whitaker, I'm glad you left. I mean that. She said it with the plainness of someone who has rehearsed a thing and decided the rehearsed version was worse than the plain one. I was sorry it took me this long to say so. She walked out. Mabel stood alone in her shop. She looked at the envelope. She thought about the house in Columbus, which she had not thought about in 11 years. With any kind of attachment, it had been his house. It had never felt like hers, and leaving it had not felt like loss but like escape. What she felt looking at the envelope now was not grief for Edmund, and it was not longing for what might have been. What she felt was something more complicated, the reckoning of a woman who has been handed back, in the form of property, a portion of the time that was taken from her, and who is not sure what that means about the nature of accounting, about whether the world ever actually evens up or only creates the appearance of it. She picked up the envelope. She opened it. Inside was a short letter in Edmund's handwriting, which she recognized the way you recognized Oscar by shape rather than by looking directly at it. He had not written much. He was not a man given to long explanations. He wrote that the house was hers, that he knew what he had done, that he was not asking forgiveness because he understood he had forfeited the right to ask it. The last line said, "You were right to leave. You were always right." She read it twice. She folded it. She put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in the wooden box next to the decree and her contracts. She stood up. She was still standing when Colton came through the door at noon. He had been coming by at noon on Tuesdays for 3 weeks now, ever since the shop opened. Always with some credible reason involving supplies from Aldrich, and he looked at her and stopped immediately. What happened, he said. She told him. All of it in the order it had happened, in the clean, direct way she had developed for telling him things, because he received information without needing her to manage his reaction to it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The house in Columbus, he said. Yes. What are you going to do with it? Sell it, she said. I don't want the house. I want what it's worth. He looked at her. You're sure? I have never wanted that house, she said. I want what I can do with what it's worth. The shop, it's good, Colton. It's mine and it's good. But if I had the capital to buy rather than rent, to build inventory, to hire a girl for the simpler alterations so I could take on more commission work, she stopped. She was talking faster than she usually allowed herself. Yes, I'm sure. He was looking at her with the expression she had come to know best, the one where he was deciding to say the thing, rather than the safer alternative. I have something to say, he said, and I want you to hear all of it before you react. She straightened. Say it. Burkett's been after me for 2 years to buy into the ranch, he said. He's getting older. His sons aren't interested in the land. He wants someone he trusts to take a stake, and he's offered me terms I could meet if I had a reliable income alongside the ranch work. He paused. I've been holding off because the terms require a partner. Not a financial partner necessarily, just the bank in Cheyenne wants to see a stable household, not a single man with wages and ambition. He met her eyes. I'm not telling you this to put pressure on a decision. I'm telling you because I said I would be honest with you, and this is part of my honest situation. She looked at him. You're telling me, she said slowly, that we have both, independently, arrived at a place where our individual plans have become more possible in combination. Yes, he said, that's what I'm telling you. That is a very practical observation. I'm a practical man, and you're all. She stopped. Also what, he said. Also the man who fixed my wagon brace in the night and never said a word about it, she said. And I'm trying to figure out how to hold both of those things at once. He came around the cutting table, not grabbing, not rushing the same way he always moved, leaving her space to step back if she needed it. He stopped a foot away from her and looked at her directly in the January light and said, Mabel, I want to build something with you. The ranch, the shop, all of it, I want to build it beside you. Not for you, not at you, beside you. You keep everything you're making here. Your name stays on that door whether anything else changes or not. He paused. But I think we both know this stopped being about wagon braces a long time ago. She looked at him. She thought about wool forgiving mistakes. She thought about the seal that had felt like her own skin, and the loosening that had been happening since October, since the road, since a man had dug forward instead of sideways and given her a way out instead of a deeper hole. She said, ask me properly. Something in his face went still and then very, very alive. Mabel Whitaker, he said. His voice was steady and quiet and meant every syllable. Will you marry me? Not because it solves things, because I want to go to sleep knowing you're there and wake up knowing the same thing, for as many years as we have. The shop was very quiet. The winter light came through the south windows. Her name was on the door. Yes, she said. It came out without the weight she had expected, without the cost. Clear as a good seam, right as a corner that turns perfectly. Yes, I will. He put his hand out the same way he'd done on the road, not grabbing, just present, and this time she took it. She had said yes on a Tuesday. By Wednesday the whole town knew. She had not told anyone. Colton had not told anyone, she was fairly certain of that, because he was not a man who announced things before they were ready to be announced. But Red Creek had its own intelligence, assembled from small observations by people who paid attention to other people's business the way other towns paid attention to weather. And apparently the sight of Mabel Whitaker taking Colton Reeves's hand in the window of her shop on Main Street had been observed by at least 3 separate pairs of eyes. And by Wednesday morning, the information had traveled the full circuit. She knew it had traveled when Mrs. Hartley, who ran the boarding house where Mabel no longer lived, but still took her morning coffee most days out of habit, stopped her on the street and said, "Is it true then?" with a face that was trying to be neutral and failing entirely. "Is what true?" Mabel said. "Don't be difficult, Mrs. Hartley said. "You know perfectly well what." Mabel looked at her. "Yes," she said, "it's true." Mrs. Hartley made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and something more complicated and said, "Good. He's a solid man. Solid men are rarer than people think." She squeezed Mabel's arm, briefly but firmly, the way a woman who doesn't make large gestures makes a large gesture, and walked on. Mabel stood on the street for a moment. She was not accustomed to people being pleased on her behalf. It was a different sensation from being congratulated, which she had experienced in professional contexts and knew how to receive. This was more personal than that, the specific warmth of someone who knew enough of your story to understand what the news meant. She went back to the shop. Clara Voss came in that afternoon with a bottle of something she had put up herself in the summer, a cherry preserve that she presented without ceremony and without much in the way of sentiment, which was Clara's particular form of warmth and which Mabel had come to appreciate deeply. "I told you that man had sense," Clara said, setting the jar on the cutting table. "First time I heard you mention him. You heard me mention him. You mentioned the wagon, and then you mentioned the brace. And then you mentioned his name once, too many times, for someone you claimed not to be thinking about." Clara gave her the brisk look of a woman who had raised 4 children and could detect evasion at considerable distances. When spring, most likely, Mabel said. We haven't set a date. Set it soon. Winters here are long and there's no reason to be unnecessarily alone in them. Clara picked up the coat she'd brought in for alteration and handed it over. The right sleeve's coming apart at the shoulder seam. Has been for a month. I kept meaning to come in. They did not discuss the engagement again. They discussed the shoulder seam, the correct approach to reattaching a sleeve that had been strained by too much fence mending in cold weather, and whether the coat would take another winter or needed replacing. This was, Mabel thought, exactly right. The coat needed fixing. The fixing was what mattered. The preserve was on the table, and that was enough said about the rest of it. Colton came in that Saturday, as he always did, and she watched him walk through the shop door and thought about how differently she saw him now than she had 3 months ago, not because he had changed, but because she had been watching more carefully, or perhaps watching more honestly, which was not the same thing. He was the same man who had stood at the edge of the road with his fence pliers. The same man who dug forward instead of sideways. The same man who said, "I'll be here," and then was there. She had not understood when she was 22 that consistency was a form of love. She understood it now. "People are talking," she said when he sat down. "I expect so," he said. "You all right with that?" "I'm deciding," she said. "Ask me in a week." He smiled, the real one, brief and genuine, the one she had been cataloging since October without admitting she was doing it. "Fair enough. I want to talk about practical things," she said. "Good. So do I. The Columbus house, I've written to Patterson about engaging a property agent in Ohio. Whatever it sells for, I want it kept separate, my capital." "That's right," he said immediately. No hesitation. "And the shop stays in my name. The lease, the inventory, the commissions, all of it. Your arrangement with Burkett is yours. We keep separate accounts and a shared one for household." He looked at her steadily. "Mabel, I told you your name stays on that door." "I meant the rest of it too." "I know you meant it," she said. "I'm saying it out loud anyway, so we're both clear and it never needs to be discussed again." "Then we're clear," he said. "Good." She opened her order book. "Now, Ruth Voss's wedding is in 3 weeks, and I still have 2 bridesmaids' dresses to finish. And if you're going to sit in that chair on Saturdays, you might as well be useful. Hand me that blue thread." He reached for the thread without comment. She took it without thanks, and that, she would think later, was the moment she knew it was going to be all right, not the yes, not the hand taken in the winter light, but this. The blue thread passed between them like something ordinary, like something that had always been happening. They married in April. Mabel had been very clear about the wedding, small, practical, and conducted without the kind of ceremony that would require her to perform emotions she was still in the process of learning how to have in public. The ceremony was at the church on the east side of town, performed by a minister named Aldert, who had come to Red Creek the previous fall and whose sermons Mabel had heard twice and found admirably brief. There were 12 people present, including Clara Voss and her family, Aldrich and his wife Mrs. Hartley, Patterson, and 3 of the ranch hands from Burkett's place who had known Colton long enough to warrant standing witness. Mabel wore a dress she had made herself. She had started it in February, in the early mornings before the shop opened, when the light was still thin and the street was quiet. She had used a wool crepe in a blue so deep it was almost navy, not the green silk Bellamy had tried to give her, which was in Aldrich's back room, and which she had eventually bought at cost and intended to use for something that was entirely her own choice but blue, the color she had always found steadying. She had put the seams in by hand, slowly, with the kind of attention she gave only to work that mattered. She had lined it in cream cotton and set small buttons at the wrist that she had carved from bone the previous winter in the evenings, which was a skill her mother had taught her, and which she had not practiced in years, and found returned to her hands like a conversation resumed. The dress fit her exactly because she had made it for the body she had, not for the body that other people sometimes implied she should wish for. It was a full-figured woman's dress, cut to honor the actual shape of her, and it was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are exactly what they intend to be. Clara Voss, when she saw it, put her hand over her mouth. You made that, she said. Last month, Mabel said. You made your own wedding dress. Who better, Mabel said. Clara laughed, which was the right response, and then composed herself, and then laughed again, and Mabel found herself laughing too, the kind that surprised her. That came without warning, and felt like something loosened from somewhere it had been held too long. Colton, when she came through the church door, looked at her the way she had not been looked at in so long, she had almost stopped believing the look was real. Not at the dress, at her, the whole of her, all at once, with an expression that was completely unguarded, and that she understood, meeting it, was what it looked like when a man saw exactly what he wanted, and was not ashamed of wanting it. She held his gaze all the way down the aisle. The ceremony was short. The vows were the traditional ones, and she said them in a clear, steady voice, and when she got to the word obey, she said it in a tone that made Patterson, standing to the left, bite down on something that wanted to be a smile. And she was fairly certain Colton's expression had the same quality, and she decided that was exactly right. He put the ring on her finger, a plain gold band, nothing ornate, which was what she had asked for, and which fit her correctly, because he had measured her finger while she was sleeping 2 weeks earlier, she discovered, by tracing it on paper, which was the most Colton thing she could have imagined him doing. They walked out of the church into April. The Wyoming April was not the gentle arrival of spring that people in softer climates described. It was a negotiation, cold still present and warmth making its case, the two of them jostling for position in a way that produced weather you could not predict from 1 hour to the next. She had come to love it. It was honest Wyoming weather. It did not pretend. They had a meal at the hotel dining room with their 12 guests, and Burkett, who was 73, and had the manner of a man who had seen everything, and been impressed by very little, and had reached the age where he said exactly what he thought, sat across from Mabel after the meal, and studied her for a moment and said, "He's been different since October. I couldn't figure out what changed. Now I see." "How has he been different?" Mabel said. "Patient," Burkett said. "He was always patient. But there's patient because you're waiting for nothing, and patient because you're waiting for something worth waiting for." He picked up his glass. "He knew the difference before I did." She thought about that for a long time afterward. They moved to the ranch in May, when the partnership with Burkett was formalized, and the papers were signed, and the land that Colton had been working for 5 years became, in the legal sense, partly his. Mabel kept the shop. She drove the 3 miles into town 4 days a week. With Agnes, who had been comfortably settled in Burkett's barn since November, and had strong and well-established tension about her schedule, pulling the small wagon that Mabel had rebuilt the previous winter with a new front axle and a repainted box in which she considered privately the finest vehicle she had ever owned. The commute was not a hardship. She used it to think. She was a woman who needed thinking time, who processed the world best in motion, and the 3 miles each way gave her the quiet and the rhythm she needed to move through problems. She thought about patterns. She thought about fabric. She thought about the women who came into the shop and what they needed, and how she could serve it. She thought, sometimes, about nothing at all, with the Wyoming hills around her and Agnes's steady pace beneath her, and the particular quality of peace that she had not expected to find, and that she was still, 9 months in, slightly surprised to be living inside. The shop had grown faster than she had planned for. By the end of the first summer, she had taken on a girl named Hattie, 16 and sharp-eyed, and with naturally gifted hands that Mabel recognized immediately, and began training with the same directness her own mother had used, not coddling, not performing patience, just showing and correcting and showing again until the skill was there. Hattie was the daughter of a family that had come from Tennessee the previous year and had not yet found their footing in Wyoming. And the income mattered to them in the concrete way that income mattered to people who were building something from very little, which Mabel understood with the whole of her body. She paid Hattie a fair wage, better than fair by Red Creek standards. When Hattie's mother came in the 3rd week to thank her, Mabel said, "She's earning it. You can thank me when she's better than I am, which will be in about 3 years at the rate she's going." Hattie's mother looked at her with an expression that moved through several stages and arrived at something that was very close to what Mrs. Hartley had shown her on the street in January, the particular warmth of someone who understood what they were being given. The women kept coming. Clara's network turned out to extend further than 12 miles in any direction. It extended the full radius of Red Creek's neighboring ranches and homesteads, which meant women came in from distances that astonished Mabel initially and stopped astonishing her by September, because she had begun to understand that what she had built was not simply a place to get clothes fixed. It was a place where women came and talked to each other, where the wait for an alteration became a conversation about seeds and weather, and the particular challenges of raising children in country that required everyone to be harder than they wanted to be. She had not planned this, but she had stopped being surprised by things she hadn't planned, because her life in Red Creek was teaching her, steadily, that what she built and what grew were not always the same thing, and that the growing was usually better. Colton watched all of this with the quiet attention she had come to understand was his primary mode of love, not grand demonstration, not speeches, but witness. He saw what she was doing. He said so, sometimes, in the direct way he had. "You're building something that matters," and did not elaborate, which she had learned to receive as the highest form of the compliment, because he was not a man who used words to fill space. He worked the ranch with the same steadiness he had always worked the fence lines, the cattle, the early mornings and late evenings, the physical texture of a life spent in direct contact with land that required constant attention. He was good at it in the way she was good at her work, not because he had decided to be, but because it was simply what he was, the thing his hands knew, the place his mind went clear. They were different in almost every surface way, and the same in the ways that turned out to matter. The first difficult winter came in their second year. It came the way Wyoming winters came when they meant business fast and absolute. Dropping 4 feet of snow in 3 days in November, and following it with temperatures that made outside work dangerous and inside work necessary, and the whole enterprise of ranching a daily exercise in keeping things alive when the cold was actively trying to kill them. They lost 11 cattle in the first week, which was not catastrophic but was a genuine blow to the finances, to the morale, and to Colton in a particular way that she watched carefully, because she was learning to read him the way she read difficult fabric, the way you read anything you cared about preserving. He came in the third night, after a 14-hour day, and sat at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands, and she put coffee in front of him and sat across from him and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say about 11 dead cattle in the cold, and sometimes what a person needed was not words but simply someone present in the dark. He lifted his head eventually and looked at her. "I keep going back over what I should have moved earlier," he said. "You moved everything you could with the information you had," she said. The storm came faster than anyone predicted. Burkett lost 6. The Haskell Ranch lost 20. "I know," he said. "I know that, but it doesn't help, not yet," he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat that way until the coffee was gone, and the worst of the evening's weight had shifted somewhere more manageable. She had not expected this part, not the hardship itself, which she had anticipated, but the particular relief of sharing it, of being the person who sat across the table and stayed. She had spent so many years being the only person who sat with her own difficulties that she had forgotten, or perhaps never fully learned, that difficulty shared was not difficulty doubled. It was something different from that, something that made the carrying possible, in a way carrying alone never quite was. She thought about the road, about the mud and the failing light and the wagon and the decision she had almost made to die trying rather than accept a hand. She thought about what she would have lost by that choice. The spring brought calves and recovery, and the particular resilience of people who had gone through a hard thing together and come out the other side still standing. The ranch found its rhythm again. The shop had its busiest season yet, and Mabel hired a second girl, a woman, actually, 31 and widowed and in need of reliable income, whose name was Frances, and who had been sewing since childhood and needed refinement rather than foundation. They were, the three of them, a good operation. Mabel ran it the way she ran everything, directly, without excess sentiment, with complete respect for what each person could do, and clear expectations about what was required. "You're a fair boss," Hattie told her once, with the frankness of a girl who had been paying attention. "I try to be," Mabel said. "My father says fair bosses are rarer than honest politicians." Hattie paused. "He means that as a compliment. I'll take it as one," Mabel said. She was 39 years old, and she was beginning to understand something she had not understood at 35, which was that a life did not become itself all at once. It became itself slowly, through the accumulation of ordinary choices made in the right direction: the decision to dig to Patterson, to write to Mrs. Crane, to take the key, to take the hand. None of those moments had felt large when they were happening. They had felt like the next necessary thing. But the next necessary thing, repeated in the right direction, had built something she could not have described to herself 4 years ago when she was stuck in the mud on the Eastern Road. She would have said she wanted safety. What she had built was better than safety. It was a life. The twist came on a Wednesday in September, in the 5th year, and it came from the direction she had least expected. A letter arrived at the shop, addressed to Mrs. Reeves. She had kept Whitaker professionally, kept Reeves personally. A distinction she had negotiated with herself and found completely satisfying, and she nearly didn't open it immediately because the postmark was Denver, and she assumed it was from Forsyth's company, which had written twice in the past year about renewed interest in her quilts for their Eastern market, a conversation she was finally ready to have. It was not from Forsyth. It was from a woman named Georgette Aldman, who identified herself as the founder of a society in Denver dedicated to what she called the advancement of women's practical education, which was a phrase that Mabel read twice, with a sharpening attention. The society was 4 years old. It ran classes in cities but had been trying, without success, to establish a rural program that could reach women on homesteads and ranches who had no access to instruction. They had heard of her shop. They had heard of what she had built in Red Creek. They were asking whether she would be willing to consult on the design of such a program, potentially pilot it from Red Creek, and if the pilot succeeded, help expand it to 3 other Wyoming towns. They would pay her for the consulting work, properly. With a contract, she read the letter 3 times. She set it on the cutting table. She stood in her shop in September, with Hattie at the sewing station, and Francis doing alterations in the corner and the sound of the street outside. And she felt something she had not felt since she opened the door and saw her name on the sign, that particular quality of recognition, the feeling of a thing arriving that you had been moving toward without knowing it was the destination. She wrote back the same day. She told Colton that evening. He read the letter at the kitchen table, and she watched his face, the way she always watched his face when something mattered. And he looked up, and his expression had that quality she loved most in him, the quality of a man who was genuinely pleased by something that had nothing to do with himself. "You're going to do it," he said. "I'm going to write with conditions," she said. "The pilot stays in Red Creek. The program is mine to design. I keep my shop, of course," he said, "and I want your opinion on the contract before I sign anything." He looked at her. She had not in 4 years asked him to review a contract. She handled her own business with complete independence, and he had never suggested otherwise. That she was asking now was not weakness. They both understood that it was the particular use of a resource she trusted, which was a different thing entirely. "I'll look at it," he said. "You'll make better decisions than I will." "But I'll look. That's all I need," she said. The pilot program launched the following spring. It was not large. 6 women initially, meeting at the shop on Thursday mornings, learning the skills that Mabel had spent a lifetime acquiring, and that she had never, until now, thought to put into a form she could hand to someone else. Pattern reading, fabric selection, the geometry of a seam, the economics of a commission, how to price, how to negotiate, how to know what your work was worth and hold to it when someone tried to pay you less. That last part was the one they needed most. She taught it with the directness of a woman who had spent 20 years figuring it out the hard way. She told them what she had learned. She told them what it had cost. She told them that knowing your value and being willing to say it out loud were two different skills, and both required practice, and that neither one would come without discomfort, and that the discomfort was worth it. One of the women, a homesteader named Grace who had come 30 miles on horseback for the Thursday sessions, said at the end of the third week, "Nobody ever told me that before. That I was allowed to know what I was worth." Mabel looked at her across the cutting table. "You were always allowed," she said. "Somebody just forgot to mention it." Grace looked back at her with an expression that Mabel recognized from the inside, the particular feeling of a woman who has been given a permission she didn't know she needed, finding out that it had always been hers. By the end of the first year, there were 14 women in the Thursday program. By the end of the second, the society in Denver had funded 2 additional sessions per week, and 3 women from the original group had started taking in commission work of their own. Hattie, at 18, was teaching the introductory sessions on Thursday mornings, while Mabel handled the advanced work. Georgette Aldman came to Red Creek in the third year to see the program in operation, and she sat in the corner of the shop and watched for 4 hours, and then sat across the cutting table from Mabel and said, "This is better than what we described in the letter." "Most things are," Mabel said, "when you actually build them instead of just writing about them." Aldman laughed. "We want to expand 4 more towns. I want you to train the women who will run them." Mabel thought about it for exactly as long as it required. "I'll need 6 months to set up the curriculum properly. And I need someone to run Red Creek while I travel for the training sessions." "Hattie's nearly ready, but not quite. Give her another year," Aldman said. "We have time." "You have time," Mabel said. "I'm 41. Don't waste mine." Aldman looked at her for a moment with the expression of a woman who had encountered a great many people in her work and had just met one she would not forget. "6 months," she said, "then we go." She went home that evening and told Colton. He was mending a piece of harness at the kitchen table, the ordinary, unglamorous work that occupied his evenings as often as anything else, and he listened and set the harness down and said, 4 towns. 4 to start. You'll be traveling some." "Yes." "You're all right with that?" She looked at him. "Are you?" He picked the harness back up. "I've got Agnes," he said. "I'll manage." She sat down across from him. "Colton." "Mabel, I need you to say more than that." He set the harness down again. Looked at her directly. "I think what you built in this town is something real," he said. "And I think what those 4 towns are going to have because of you is something those women don't have now and can't get any other way. And I think," he paused, "I think the woman who drove herself into a mud hole on the Eastern Road because she would not ask for help has figured out how to build something that means other women don't have to carry everything alone." She sat with that. "That's why I married you," she said. "For the speeches? For knowing when to make one." He picked up the harness. She picked up the letter from Aldman. And they sat in the kitchen of the ranch they had built together, in the particular quiet of 2 people who knew each other well enough to be silent in the same room, which was, she had come to understand, one of the most profound forms of belonging she had ever experienced. 5 years after the wagon sank in the mud, Mabel Reeves Whitaker on the sign, Reeves in the life she had chosen, sat on the porch of the ranch house in the September evening and looked at what she had made. The shop on Main Street with her name on the door. The women on Thursday mornings who now knew what their work was worth. Hattie, who had 3 months ago taken her first solo commission from a Denver buyer and negotiated her own price without flinching. Frances, who had bought out her rental agreement on a room above the hardware store and was talking about opening a second sewing operation on the north end of town. The 4 towns that were waiting. Colton came out and sat beside her, and they did what they did in evenings when the work was done. They watched the hills, and they said a little and meant a great deal, and the Wyoming sky did what it always did at dusk, which was to become something enormous and unhurried and full of stars. "You're thinking," he said. "Always," she said. "About the 4 towns?" "About the road," she said. "The first one, the mud." He was quiet. "I almost didn't stop," she said. "I almost kept driving even after it sank. I sat there for I don't know how long, telling myself I could do it alone, that I had done everything alone, that asking for help was the same as losing. I know, he said. I was so afraid, she said. I'd been afraid for so long I didn't know it was fear anymore. I thought it was just how I was. He reached over and took her hand. Not grabbing, just present, the same way he had always been. It wasn't how you were, he said. It was what you learned. Those are different things. She turned her hand in his and held it properly, the full grip of a woman who had stopped hedging. She looked at the hills. She thought about the road and the mud and the new wood on the old brace and the key on the table, and yes said in January light with her name on the door. She thought about every woman who had sat across her cutting table and been told that she was allowed to know what she was worth. She thought about what it meant to build something real, not the building she had imagined at 20, not the life she had planned before it broke, but this one, this actual one. Assembled from choices she had made in the right direction, when the right direction was difficult and the wrong one was easy. The strongest people she had ever known were not the ones who had never needed help. They were the ones who had learned, eventually, which hands were safe enough to hold. Mabel Whitaker Reeves had been one of the bravest women in Wyoming since the day she drove alone into its roads, with everything she owned in a wagon and her pride worn like armor. But she had become, finally, something better than brave. She had become whole, and a woman who has been broken and rebuilt and learned to stand beside instead of stand alone. That woman does not simply survive her life. She builds something with it that outlasts her. And Mabel had built exactly that, and she knew it, and she held her husband's hand in the September dark and watched the stars come out over Wyoming and knew, with the clean certainty of a seam that will never need repairing, that she had finally, completely, arrived at the life she was always meant to be living.